good evening, friends. Today, I am going to make a review of a book. That book is written by uh, Cambridge Publications, and the book name is Empire and Informations. And the author of this book is C.A. Bailey, Christopher Bailey. He is professors by professions, and he was the editorial boards of this book. And another person along with Mr. Bailey is Raj Narayan Chandprabhakar. He is the fellow of Trinity College and lecturers in the history University of Cambridge, and Gordon Johnson. He is president of Wolfo College and the director Center of South Asian Study, University of Cambridge. So let's we see what exactly the review tell about the history of the knowledge system, and the book name is Empire and Information. A central purpose of this book is to examine the British political intelligence system in North India between 1780 to 1860. It described the network of India running a spy, news writers, and the knowledge secretariat, where home official of the East India Company recruit and develop in their effort to secure the military, political, and social information. It considered how the colonial authority interpret and misinterpreted the materials derived from the sources. It drew the attention to the gap, distortions, and the panic about the Malikans' native plot, which official the system of imperial surveillance. So within the North India, and for the comparison's sake, outside its borders in Nepal, Burma, and beyond the northwestern frontier. Finally, the book examines the extent to which intelligence failure and success and contribute to the course of the rebellions of 1857 and 59, so collapse of the East India Company government and the form of the following specifications. So the quality of the military and the political intelligence available to the European colonial power was evidently a critical determination of their success in the conquest and the profitable governance. So equality, this information provide the raw material on which the Europeans drew when they tried to understand the politics, economic activity, and the culture of their indigenous subject. So the book therefore addressed some of the most traditional as well as some of the most recent controversial issue in imperial South Asian historiography. The study also concerned the communication and the movement of knowledge within the Indian society, and examining the role of the communities of the writers in the bazaar and the culture of the political debate. It is a study of the social communication and the sense used in the carol usage and the pioneering work. It considered those specialists who help to articulate indigenous system of knowledge and keep information, idea, and gossip flowing. So the astrological physicians, expert in the philosopher's stones, and the midwife, marriage makers, and the other knowledgeable people who brought news from one community and region to another community. It was the destiny and flexibility of the indigenous routine of social communications which explain why North Indians were able to make such a striking use of the printing press. The newspaper and the public meetings, once those innovations finally begins to spread rapidly amongst them in the 1830 and 1840. So while the modern Indian history should certainly not to be depicted as a single grand narrative culminating in the emergence of the nationalism and the density of social communication, and demonstrated by this book, does in fact help to explain why the political leader in a poor country with relatively low rate of general literacy and should have been able to create a widely diffused and popular nationalist movements as early it is noticed there. So these two systems, the colonial state surveillance and agency and the autonomous network of the social communicators, and the overlapping and interpreted, but the overlap was incomplete, and the meeting between the British and the Indian agency was given by the suspicious distortions and violence. For here at the point of interactions between political intelligence and the indigenous knowledge, colonial rule was its most vulnerable, and here new communities of the knowledge, India, which used to be the colonial state, communication and ideology, independently of it and against, began to emerge even in the early 19th century as the Express newspaper. So the Friends of the India remarked in 1830, echoing the administrator and Sir John Malcolm's Our Indian Empire in one opinions and the progress of knowledge would probably initiate the separation of India from the England. So a contemporary British officer, seeing the pile of newly printed and vernaculars books in the office of the Mount Stuart Elphinstone's governor of Bombay, exclaimed in the similar term, "It is our the new high road back to the Europe." Neither Indian historians nor historians of other European dependency have paid very much attention to the intelligence of propaganda system of colonial power. So that through the intelligence study have become the major industry of Europeans and the American historians who have come to be the regard and the political surveillance and social communications at critical features of the modern state of society. Recent work on the India have considered the related area of colonial knowledge systems and the discourse focusing on the learned theory of Orientalism and rather than day-to-day information and its sources. So several scholars too have begun to be considered the native information and the impact of the press and the print capitalisms. So nevertheless, state surveillance and the social communications remain a poorly studied area. By contrast, some of the more important work of the fiction and to emerge from the Indo-British encounter are located perceivably on the cusp between the British intelligence and the indigenous knowledge. So Rudyard Kipling came to take the most celebrated example and introduce the cost of characters, which find the pale reflection in the study. In the Kipling novel, the reader meet Kim himself and the Eurasians spy in the great game of espionage in the Central Asia, and the Huris Babu, the learned native informant, and alongside them the Kipling memorably pictures the eddies of the news and gossip flowing from the Grand Trunk Road from the Lahore to Banaras, and the gossip following down to Grand Trunk Road from Lahore to Banaras and carried over by the Afghan horse dealer, Hindu bankers in pilgrims destined for the holy place of the Hindustan and the Buddhism. So the book seeks to establish the broad framework for the study of those two elements and the state intelligence and social communications by the using the concept of the information order, and this term has been adapted from the work of the economic geographer the Manuel Castells, who has written of the informal city, and the Castells create the new information technology of the late 20th century as a type of social formations and rather than simple adjacence to the existing economic force to the neutral technology process. He saw how the North America after the 1960 information technology changed the pattern of the urban living and speed its proceed of industrializations and the income differentiation and the de-skills large part of the workforce, especially those already disadvantaged such as poorly educated minority groups and the women. What is important about this approach is that has seen the generators of knowledge and institution of information and collection and diffusions of the discourse, which they give rise to the autonomous forces for economic and social change. They are not reduced to the status of the contingency of the late industrial capitalism and the modern state, and the knowledge itself is a social formation knowledgeable people from the distance and the active social segment with their own interest and the four castrals intellectuals property including the education was much the foundations of the social class and economy, as the financial landed property was for the earlier generations of the social theory, rather than being the residual category and relegated to the end of the history book in the chapter entitled Intellectual Development and Communications. These considerations of the study of social changes, such as approach ought to be the bring benefit of Indian history, and a subject of whose proponents have until recently been preoccupied with the sociology of institutions, the determinants of the sociology of knowledge. Equally, Indian intellectuals' history has been more radically diverse from the social context than the many other areas of historical study. It needs to be restored to that context. What we have called the informations and orders should not be seen as the things, many more the things, and a state to the economy of things. So it's a hastical device, and people need to be discussed about separate from the world of power and economic exploration, but extends both the prior knowledge of the economic resource which coming generated from the Indian citizen. So the Republic of Venice and the 18th century, we see the grander examples of the likewise society and similar level of the economic development. And in the early modern society, we generally talk about the contemporary industrial society and the informations of the pre-modern society, and the differs greatly from one another in the status and use of the literacy, and also in the quality and effectiveness of the system of information collections and distributions. So these differences were partially determined by the economic monasteries, and the economy required a different form of knowledge collections and archive making from those where the customary labor due to share and the produce were taken by the elite. At the same time, the differences in the ideology and the religious practices also molded and contrasting informations other. The reformed Buddhist hierarchy of the early modern Thailand and the Burma, for example, attempted to import a standard rule of life and the wider populations, a way which was impossible for the loose network of the Indian Brahmin prestige and monk and king. Consequently encourage a more widespread systems of popular education than existed in the most part of the North India. So colonial knowledge, European colonial state faced the obvious problem in engaging with the information system, and consequent need to be reached into the manipulated indigenous systems of communications in new colony. So, but because this indigenous system differed from each other in the important respect, and colonialism in turn to be the preside over the widely different thing. Simple diffusion of the language made the European initially dependent on the skills of linguistic translate and man two tongues or the Hindustani, and has to be the Dubasa. Dubasa, that means those people knowing more than one language. In our view, the problem of British faced the understanding the controlling even the South Asian derive much more the shaping of the things, and the Indian information systems older and specifically superficially the colonial rule from the any particular cultural bias and the prejudice resulting from the assimilations of the things. So because they were not in the general concern in spite of their faith and the mingles with their genetics with the Indian populations, and the Indian Christians and Americans were of course important. Information and erosion played a big role, especially in the generation of military knowledge for the British conquering and later the things like that. So again, the British in India could not rely on the patrimonial knowledge systems on which the independent state and some colonial government could draw. In India, then the British were forced to master and manipulate the information system of their Hindu and Mughal presidents. This was system through this was limited and the geographical range and impact of indigenous agency were modified and new task and said to be collecting the different types of the things. Public information created a new types of native information. So a statistical movement which explains export and the old Indians hand in the Indian Medical Service and Post and Intelligence Department of the Army and gave the colonial authority and superficial knowledge. Away from the privilege and however the British were still ignorance of the event 1857 and brutally revealed the chain of surveillance while the most vulnerable were the body of elite literatures, hereditaries, servants and information collecting of village. This link snapped the 1857 they partially widely together. The later 19th century rapidly just like correlated against during the 20th century. It is also the discuss about the major portions. Finally come to the conclusions in the realm of the scientific knowledge and the disciplines of the astronomy, geography and the medicines. Where Western's theory and the techniques were to achieve the dominance in for long terms and the information order of the colonial India retains the distinctly Indian futures. When this responding to the profound influence and the first chapter examining the indigenous inheritance also.